Welcome back to the Groundless Ground podcast, the leading edge of integrative mental health. I'm your host, Lisa Dale Miller. You can subscribe to, download, and review the Groundless Ground on iTunes, Google Play, YouTube, Stitcher, TuneIn, and of course, find out more at groundlessground.com. I'm ready to go. How about you? This episode is a celebration of Teja Bell, a lifelong practitioner and teacher of Aikido, Tai Chi Chuan, Qigong, Neigong, Buddhism, and Taoism. I have studied Qigong with Teja for many years and delighted in Qigong Dharma, his unique integration of Buddhist meditation and Qigong. He is an Aikido master, 6th-degree black belt, and a Roshi in the Rinzai Zen Buddhist lineage. Teja shares his remarkable introduction to martial arts as a young teen in Iowa and the succeeding long history of study with renowned teachers in Judo, Kung Fu, Young-style Tai Chi Chuan, Qigong, Liu Habafa, Buddhism, and Yoga. This is a special episode, one born from the shared heart-mind of a precious teacher and humble student. Teja Bell. This is going to be a lot of fun.
It's great to be here with you.
You know, it's almost impossible to describe you, largely because if I start doing it, people will not believe me. You are a 6th-degree black belt in Aikido and master in the Rinzai Zen tradition. I believe you have studied Yang-style Tai Chi Chuan for so many years. I'm not even sure how many systems of Qigong you've studied intensively. That also includes many Neigong systems. And then, of course, almost all the other Buddhist traditions you've actually practiced in.
Yeah, I'm a cross-trainer, definitely. Traditions of the Vipassana, the Mahayana, and certainly the Trans-Himalayan traditions.
One thing listeners really love, especially with someone like you, is to hear how you initially got introduced to all of this.
That's a good question. I grew up in Iowa, as a matter of fact. So how can an Iowa boy be interested in Asian arts and culture and so on? Well, the answer is actually quite simple. I grew up in a household with my great aunt, and Leona had been a missionary in China for over 40 years. And she had been there primarily helping to end the practice of foot binding. She was quite old when I knew her, and she passed away when I was 14 or 15 years old. So dear Aunt Leona was around, and we grew up in a household with beautiful art that she'd brought back from China, including temple wall hangings. Our favorite thing, my siblings and I, would be to listen to her stories of China. She told us bedtime stories and daytime stories, and it was amazingly interesting. When I first met a martial arts teacher, sometime between 12 and 13, it was a natural for me. So I started to study Kung Fu and Japanese Judo.
And this is a time in America when even in New York, where I grew up, there wasn't a lot of martial arts. There wasn't a lot of judo around. There wasn't a lot of kung fu around. How in the world did you find somebody to teach you back then?
This was the time in American history, and certainly in the history of the Midwest, if you practiced yoga, which I started probably at 15 or 16 years old, with a teacher that my stepmother had introduced me to, a woman named Sarah Plummer, who later I went to live with and studied with. You know, if you studied yoga, it was basically the devil's art. Anything that was even slightly out of the normal was considered very weird. So I grew up a lot as an iconoclast in this culture. It just felt right to me, so I kept doing it. It could be part of my stubborn streak. But I met Tatsuma Makami. It was kind of a one-on-one relationship.
Wow.
You know, I think of the Karate Kid, right? So I would go over to his dojo and he would throw me around and then try to sit me down to be quiet for meditation. And of course, I just wanted to get into the martial arts and because that was so much fun. Studied with him for a good number of years. So he passed away about 12, 15 years ago back in Iowa. So Tatsumo brought me Kung Fu, brought me into Judo.
At some point, the Qigong showed up.
Well, Kung Fu, of course, has its roots in the Bodhidharma traditions of the I Ching Jing, the Xishui Jing, those kinds of so-called internal arts, and they're sometimes called Negong, they're sometimes referenced as Qigong. So I might have learned a little bit of that, especially in the patterns of breathing and storing qi in the hara. And I became acquainted with very wonderful taekwondo teacher, Inmuk Kim, who's 9th degree black belt. Along with my brother, we were at the dojang all the time, putting in 18 to 22 hours a week in training. It was amazing for a late teenager into my early 20s. At around 20 years old, I discovered Aikido. It was a little bit later when I met Lilita and began to study from a lineage master in the Yang style that he also introduced the more formal forms of Qigongs, probably 1975 or something right in there.
We've just gone through a litany of martial arts. I think you might be the right person to give people a sense of how the knowledge of internal martial arts, where it started and how it moved around the countries in Asia and became these different kinds of forms.
Lisa, that's a very profound question. One has to say that so much of this is based on lore and very little written evidence, based on a little bit of archaeological evidence, and certainly the stories that have been passed down in lineage traditions over millennia. There are various stories about the confluence of Buddhism and Taoism as it came to China. We know the stories of Buddhist practices and the tantric practices moving from northern India into Tibet. But the whole trans-Himalayan region that is now also Nepal and Afghanistan to a certain degree, these had ancient traditions of meditation. The non-dual traditions and the mystical traditions were brought up, were nourished in these cultures. We know the story of Milarepa. To a certain degree, we have the lineages laid out in Zen, a little bit less in the so-called Vipassana tradition.
I would say the vast majority of meditators that I have met, there's a very teeny, tiny percentage of them that practice any kind of martial art, internal art. It's just not something they do. It appears as though at some point these things got separated out from each other.
Doesn't it, though?
The thing that's so beautiful about you and also about Radiant Heart Qigong is that the method you've created is kind of the antidote to this. You're bringing back the innate connection between working the systems in the body and also working contemplative practice.
Let me tell a couple stories. Radiant Heart Qigong has had this name for really only about maybe 20, a little bit more than 20 years. I was doing a number of Qigong systems and martial arts systems, including Liya Haba Fa, but also Xingyi, Bagua, and of course, wonderful teachers from China and elsewhere teaching Tai Chi Chuan. So that has always been connected with some forms of cultivation of the qi, cultivation of the breath, cultivation of awareness, contemplative presence. I began doing really comparative research in the practices of the Qigong as it related to the Chinese internal arts, probably in the late 80s, looking at their connection both with Japanese and Chinese arts, noticing that there are many similarities, different names, slight variances in the approach or the methodology of the practices, but they were essentially the same in some ways. What I did with Radiant Heart Qigong was to curate from that comparative research and out of my direct experience of what is most valuable, the core and foundational practices of what is called Radiant Heart Qigong. And then I also had the amazing opportunity, as you well know, to integrate these practices in places like Spirit Rock and in the Zen tradition. Occasionally, but rarely, I've been invited in the Vajrayana tradition to lead some of these practices. It is a growing and evolving practice of Qigong. As my knowledge continues to grow and expand, I continue to integrate and refine and reflect on the practices that I do, and to also include the deepening that happens in the contemplative way.
I have seen you do Aikido, and let me just say, it totally blew my mind. Not that I hadn't seen Aikido before. I mean, after all, I did live in Japan for 4 years.
Yes, you did.
But when I saw you do Aikido, I had never seen anything like it. There was this intense focus and a shooting kind of energy that was coming through your practice. At that time, I had done quite a bit of Qigong already, also Tai Chi Chuan. And I had known you already through being on retreat with you
Yeah.
and having you do Qigong at Spirit Rock and being so excited that somebody was actually getting people to move around. But I thought to myself, oh my gosh, I'm wondering what Aikido does for Teja that contemplative meditation and Qigong practice doesn't do for him.
It's fabulous. I love this question. This is so good. In my experience of doing Aikido now, almost, I can't believe I'm going to say this, almost 50 years, one of the things that I've discovered and continue to discover in the practice of Aikido is that it is very much a relational practice. Maybe that seems a little bit obvious. The energy of connection is perhaps what is given this radical permission in the practice on the mat. One gets to experiment, one gets to know oneself in a way that I don't think you can know just through internal reflection, through just a mindfulness practice or just a contemplative reflective practice. This is an embodied practice that merges these energetic hemispheres of awareness and embodiment. You have the opportunity to refine, to feel into. And if one is honest in this, it can be very revealing. Places that have holes in your awareness, holes in your energy and connection, and then one has the opportunity to heal inside of that. The flow and the grounding aspect of practice of Aikido is amazing. It's unique. Now, Tai Chi Chuan, beautiful practice. I love it so much. Just like Aikido has its limitations, Tai Chi has its limitations as well in terms of the relational aspect. Yes, you can do all of the relational practices in Tai Chi, but the way that we work in Aikido, a little bit different. You get to understand the dynamics of relationship, both energetically, one could say, spiritually, but certainly on the level of manifestation.
I was playing the video in my mind of you doing Aikido. There was a man you were doing it with. And when you said the movements themselves, they appear to have so much form that you must adhere to. And yet, as you were speaking about this relational freedom or this radical relationality between the two of you, I realized it was this innate freedom within the form that is so different.
Yes, this just is a perfect opening, Lisa, to understand Morihei Ueshiba and my primary teacher, Robert Nadeau, who was a direct lineage student of O-sensei and I then of Nadeau. Understand that the practice of Aikido is not so much about the form, but about the application of principles. And you know, being with me as we practice Qigong and our Dharma, that I often talk about the practice of Qigong is the practice of integrating principles. We work with those integrative principles. We work with them in such a way that they bring life and vitality to movement. So it's not just, learning the right forms. The forms of Aikido even, they're not that complicated, but bringing the sense of calmness, centeredness, groundedness, moving out of being and presence rather than moving out of application of technique makes all the difference in the relational quality that is developed when you practice good Qigong.
So maybe that's the answer to one of the questions that I was going to ask you, which is why are Chinese and Japanese internal arts such an important complement to mind training?
those particular arts, not only have they been part of the connection in Buddhist and Taoist traditions, but that also gives me an opportunity maybe to talk about that second story that is related to an earlier question of yours.
Yes, please.
So that is the story of Bodhidharma, this legendary mystical figure who purportedly brought Buddhism, and primarily Mahayana Buddhism, to China sometime in the 5th and 6th century. The integration of this practice of Chan in Chinese was very impactful on Chinese culture and had a beautiful connection with the Taoist tradition, which was very practical in that philosophical sense, very much about attunement with nature. And with the heart of the Tao, it included qualities of kindness and compassion, simplicity, radiant well-being in some ways. When Bodhidharma then went to the Shaolin Temple at that time was not at all about martial arts. Shaolin was Buddhist, trying to study both the sutras and the teachings and have that foundation of understanding and practice. So as the story goes, and it's an important one in relationship to all of us that do Qigong and that also practice Dharma, and especially Zen, is the recognition that at a certain point, Bodhidharma apparently introduced maybe even 3 forms of Qigong Neigong to help to bring about vitality, well-being, because as the story goes, he saw the monks he was surrounded by just really lacking vitality. And they'd spend way too much time sitting and nothing was happening, you could say. So, where's the awakening? Where's the vitality? Where is this embodiment? So he brought these practices, the source of which is still under some debate, whether these were Indian yogic traditions or whether they were influenced by Taoist healing arts or energy arts or the Qigong of that time. Nevertheless, we have handed down to us in multiple forms all of these, let's say, 3 sets of Qigong Neigong that have influenced the development of Qigong generally in China, but certainly the Chan tradition in maybe the 11th century or so, when the practice of Chan moved to Japan, it became known as Zen. What got left out, as you so rightly noted, was the embodiment practices, these practices that help to maintain vitality through the rigors of various kinds of stillness practices. Most of the stillness practices got translated as sitting practices. Although, as you well know, the teachings handed down from Buddhist literature is that there are 4 basic modalities of contemplative practice, sometimes known as the 4 dignities. The seated practice, but then we also have the standing practice, which you and I do so much in the Qigong practice, the stillness practices, of which there are actually maybe a couple hundred forms of mudras or gestures with the body that are connected with standing practice. That will tie in a little bit with Liu Habafa. Of course, we have the lying down practices, very challenging lying down practices. It's also been translated as walking practices. So walking meditation is form. But by extrapolation, movement, mindfulness, presence, and movement. It's been kind of my mission, I guess you could say, in some ways, to help to bring that kind of integration, that vitality to meditators. Hey, remember this? This is what we used to do in the olden days.
The Liu Habafa.
Yeah.
It's this esoteric martial art tradition. That one is esoteric because it has more of what?
It has more of everything. So Liu Habafa means the 6 combinations and the 8 methods. Liu is 6, Ba is 8. And so there's a kind of a philosophy that brings that together. I won't go into the history right now, but it's probably between 1,000 and 1,200 years old. When I say it has a little bit of everything, I'm actually saying that it brings the essence of the 3 primary forms that we consider the Chinese internal martial arts, Tai Chi Chuan, Xing Yi Chuan, and Baguazhang, each uniquely different, are woven together by this ancient, wonderful teacher who was also known as the sleeping yogi. But he brought these practices together. So it is a fusion of internal arts that brings together the Tai Chi, Xingyi, and Bagua. There are unique differences that would be hard to put in simple terms. Maybe I'll try just a little bit. Tai Chi really works with the extension and absorption, an essential flow, even when you watch people doing the solo practices. It's beautiful to watch. It has flowing dance-like qualities, very centered when you have good practitioners doing it. In a relational context, it is always giving ground to the force of attack. It's very receptive, and that's one of the beautiful qualities, the healing qualities of Tai Chi Chuan. Xingyi is very linear. It has a certain kind of hardness to it that doesn't back down so much. Training is rigorous. The forms are simple, but they're very, very powerful, so-called fighting forms. It is said that the Xingyi comes out of spear practice in the days before gunpowder was used, and the best forms of martial arts, and it was taught by the military to military people. Xingyi means the heart intention. So it's a beautiful practice, and it doesn't have to have that quality of deep martialness. It has beautiful healing qualities, and one can practice the forms of Xingyi as a restorative or healing practice. And I often bring certain aspects of the Xingyi Neigong Qigong in the trainings that I lead. And, even on our day-longs, I will occasionally bring in some of those kinds of practices. And then we have the Bagua is very circular and spiraling. It's similar in some ways, probably of all of those, to Aikido, but it's also uniquely different. Very powerful martial art that works with moving around in spirals, never stopping, working with the 8 trigrams of the I Ching as elements or principal natures. So you bring all those together and you have a unique form that was probably primarily influenced by Xingyi in the practice of Liu Habafa.
Most people think that the heart would be contrary to fighting.
Yeah.
And yet, many of these martial arts were for protection, which would be a heart endeavor, the human desire to protect.
Beautifully spoken. That's exactly right. So later on, after Bodhidharma was gone, as they practiced in the Shaolin, dynasty changes and the impact of bandits and so on, the connection with certain martial artists then began to weave the healing and strength gaining practices that was offered through the Shaolin, then people became very proficient. Their mandate is essentially ahimsa. They're not out there using the power of their martial arts to have their own way. They have the mandate of their vows to non-harm and don't take what's not offered. And really then in the Bodhisattva way is to protect. And that protection was part of their mandate as well. The Shaolin monks definitely gained a reputation. Nobody really picked on them. Even the townspeople from various places, if there were bandits or something, would call on the temples to come and help them, and often they would.
If you're willing, it might be nice to talk about the mechanics of Qigong and its various practices.
Sure.
Explain what Qi is.
So the mysterious Qi and also the architecture, the subtle anatomy of our human life. So I'll first start with Qi, essential vitality and the presence of life in all things is Qi. And it is intimately connected with this essence called Li, which is the underlying principles of manifestation of creation. So Qi is the animating energy or life force, an intimate connection with the principles of manifestation. Well, we know this because it's as simple as understanding that if you plant an acorn, you're going to get an oak tree. So you plant cherry seeds, you get cherries, you don't get apples. That sounds simple, but it points to the intelligence of the Tao, intelligence of creation itself. The Li is these organizing principles, and the Qi is the essential animating force that is connected with that. Because where there are organizing principles, where there is manifestation, where there is movement out of the absolute into the yin and yang. You have qi and you have li. We work with it uniquely in our human system. People going to qigong class, will say, well, I don't feel qi. If we just slow down for just a moment in that relative stillness of either standing or seated meditation, feeling the vitality of life is feeling the qi. Later on, we learn to cultivate qi. We learn to actually be able to move qi in the body, use it for healing purposes, for restorative purposes, for energetic purposes, for purposes of strength. It is a little bit subtle, but not for contemplatives. Yeah, if somebody's been meditating for a long time and said, I don't know what qi is, I can get them there within a few minutes, Our practices of qigong and working in the subtle systems, it is just like meditation itself in insight into impermanence, dukkha, non-self, all of these amazing multi-dimensional areas of awareness. They take time. And the same in qigong or in internal martial arts or in aikido, in any of these practices. It takes a little bit of time for one to become aware of what that is, to settle in and rest with it, to be with that in effortless mindfulness. Then to speak briefly about the subtle architecture. The Chinese system is one that recognizes primary meridians and vessels, and the 8 extraordinary channels and so on have all these words and all these essential points that we can access awareness. So it's not only accessing awareness, but it's accessing the subtle body through connection with these points or through the gestures of our qigong. It is a little bit different than the Vedic system. So the Vedic system is the yogic system. We talk about the primary channel as being the Sasumna, and the left and right channels or the balancing channels being the Ida and Pingala. The energy centers in the yogic system are more connected with the so-called chakra system. The Chinese system, which I primarily teach, although I teach some of the integration of the Vedic systems as well, is to understand the 3 dantians, or the 3 elixir fields of presence through our amazing human bodies, to learn how to trust, to learn how to listen, be present with, and be informed and reinformed by the natural intelligence, the organizing intelligence of our human subtle body system.
I've gone back and forth between the yogic system and the Chinese system. It's not that common to find someone like you who also has both of these. My personal experience, even with my patients, I would have a very difficult time if I was using the yogic system, giving a patient something very targeted, to do something quickly, to shift the way their mind is functioning or shift the energy in the body feels. I'm actually not talking about subtle body architecture now. I'm talking about using something through the subtle body architecture to have a dramatic impact on the gross nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
The meridian system appears to have much more easy flow into the organs and the gross nervous system. And I'm wondering if you know why.
I could speculate a theory with you. I think yoga in the West has focused quite a bit on the asana and on the hatha aspect of these practices. And there's very little jnana yoga. There's always the bhakti yoga, which is often ungrounded, and then the raja yoga. One of my teachers has said, no hatha without raja, no raja without hatha. This is not just about the yogic system, it's about our contemplative systems. I know that right now you see that connection. Unless we have the integration of the embodiment with Dharma, with the mental practices, with the cognitive understanding, with the emotional intelligence, we're practicing one-handed, when really we want to practice in this healing and bilateral way. Qigong, in its relationship to healing practices and directly impacting what you've called, and rightly so, the gross nervous system, is almost immediate. because the skill of the practice brings together these primary notions, I guess you could even call them principles, of course they are, of how to do the practice, of the methodology, which is the application of slow, soft, smooth, continuous in most cases, and then the practice of being present, essential mindfulness, of learning how to feel into the body, of underdoing range of motion, connecting with poise, gaining interest and a skill in listening to the chi in our own bodies. It's really right there, but it takes a little bit of cultivation. If you are cultivating your piano playing, practice the scales and actually have the physical connection with the keys. Bach is said to have spent a half a year with his students just in how they touch the keys. The domain of practice is essential. And we've become a society in which I tried meditation once and it didn't really work. So it takes some perseverance and moving through the thresholds of resistance that we may have to reveal the value of it. I always tell my students to persevere through those plateaus and said, just be curious. Stay with it. I wouldn't teach you this if I didn't know that it works.
Sometimes I posit thoughts as a manifestation of chi.
Yeah, of course it is. When we talk about chi, we're not just talking about chi, are we? You and I, probably many of our listeners, know that everything is interconnected. So this dynamic of interconnection, we can abstract chi, or we can abstract li, or we could abstract any of the principles, but when it comes right down to it, these are all intimately interconnected. So that interconnection becomes a informing force in our awareness.
So sometimes I think about the Tibetan Buddhist model of horse and rider. Horse is the body and the rider is the mind. And if the rider is confused and all over the place, then the functioning of the body is also confused and all over the place. I would like to get a sense from you about how you think the practices of Chinese internal arts aid the arising of mental health.
The most profound question you've asked today. The practices that we do in their simplicity engage the whole person. And engaging the whole person, we're really speaking about not just the fabric of the physical body, but all the subtle aspects of manifestation as well. Attention and intention and action. The word I like to use in relationship to the outcome of the practice is coherency. We're creating internal coherency, neural coherency. We're lengthening the telomeres. We're bringing about a sense of calm through the central nervous system, bringing balance to the autonomic nervous system. Now, this calming effect isn't insular. It's not a dulling down. It's actually a brightening up. Strength has the sense of clarity. We develop this sense of coherency through the whole system so we can feel everything moving in this harmony. When our ancient sisters and brothers talked about harmony with the Tao, it wasn't just a cool saying, although it is a pretty cool saying. It is bringing that sense of actual presence, coherency through the whole system. That coherency then will often calm the discursive nature of our habitual patterning, what we think is thinking. What we think is thinking isn't always thinking. It could also be rehashing old patterns. So the healthier that we can get, the more essential vitality contributes directly to well-being, to this integration of the whole being, of the mental, emotional, spiritual, physical, energetic, all the dimensions of our being. That sense of coherency is kind of a clarity through these systems. And that is the ground of true sanity, of genuine well-being. We might say, oh, that's spiritual well-being. Of course it is, but it's throughout all the domains of our being. Even if we're sick, you can still have that same sense of well-being and coherency through the whole system.
The thing I love about Chinese internal arts is it really cuts through the whole thing about spirituality, which I think is very refreshing. Full on human being in its full on functioning is not spiritual. It's just the totality of what the amazing organism we happen to be born in is capable of when it's firing on all cylinders to function in a dynamically responsive way rather than stilted or over efforted, ego directed
Yeah.
way that most people end up behaving, but largely because the system has so much disturbance and most people are not introduced to ways to lessen disturbance or even recognize there's disturbance.
That's so great. Not all the systems of the so-called Qigong or the internal arts are the same. By one count, there are like 3,000 systems of Qigong. Some are even a little bit aberrant. Why would you want to develop enough qi to start a piece of paper on fire?
Ego is the answer to that question.
Very good. If we connect the sense of well-being and really both in our dharmic practices and in our sanghas, we're really looking for this essential wellness and understanding that what we're talking about, both in the Dharma and the Qigong, is not about a belief system. It is not about a world view. It is about understanding the principles and the application of those principles in embodiment in our lives and every day. It's not rigidity, it's freedom, it's beauty. Just look at a teacher, make sure that teacher and the students, if you're considering going to a Qigong school, that you have a good feeling with it. This could be a home.
What makes Radiant Heart Qigong so unusual is the progenitor of this methodology, Teja Bell, has genuinely engaged throughout a lifetime with such a range of practices with teachers who really are of the highest standard. The distillation that you've done of these highest teachings, offering it in such a accessible way. I have not found anything that is as targeted and integrated for the kinds of things that come up in a Western body and a Western psyche.
Yeah, it is. Thank you for those kind words. And we are in a process of evolution. It's not that we're randomly changing the forms that we work with. I'm not doing that at all. I'm not necessarily staying with one particular lineage. There are essential differences and there are essential similarities. To bring that together for the purpose of creating well-being, not for the purpose of creating a new system. Where we are in human history right now, in my view, is we're at a very, very critical point. And we need to continue to find ways to live in the wisdom of compassion, live in the space where we're actually making a difference in our relationship to one another and in our relationship to nature. This is not about resignation. We continue to practice because we know it brings about sanity.
Your job, in a way, is to introduce something people have always had and have never experienced, because there's nothing in the Western tradition that would tell anyone it exists.
That's exactly right. Wonderful teachers like Dan Siegel and Rick Hansen, they're doing great work integrating neuroscience. And I know that you, with your clients, you're bringing this healing elixir through intelligence and somatic integration that is absolutely necessary. So we're trying also to do this on a scale where our communities are sane, our communities are healthy, our relationships and the way that we interact and speak with one another are evolving in this field of wellness. The Qigong is part of it. The Dharma is part of it. It's not just leaning into the ancient forms, but understanding the integration of modern knowledge with the ancient forms is where we're at right now. If the Buddha had a cell phone, he would have been using it, I'm sure. So at least that's my speculation. In the postmodern world, we have all these amazing technology. It's not inherently bad. The way that we use it needs to be more and more intelligent.
I'm going to agree with you 100%. Then what I'm going to do is resist that particular path of integration and instead point at a path of integration where there is no difference between what's happening on a silicon chip and what's happening in a human body. Because the silicon chip exists in this world, it and us, we are all operating on the same set of principles. And the way the Western mind has organized itself around principles is poverty stricken, because what it's missing is that underlying interconnective architecture that so many cultures were fully aware of and fully functioning in before we ended up with this separation off and the complete canceling out of that. Rather than saying brain science needs to be used to prove Buddhism, prove Qigong, I would rather say give someone the direct experience of the totality of their functioning. Let them see directly what effect that has, not just on their internal experience, but how they experience their relationship to everything around them.
Beautiful. What opens up is understanding the domain of ethics, not so much in terms of the laws and rules. Ethics is often conflated with morality, and morality is maybe more relative and specific to cultures and communities. So ethics is the common ground throughout all of these, that integration of all the precepts that are common to the world's great religions, non-harming and respect of life. When we have this as our ethical ground, then we don't have to wonder about rules so much.
I think you're talking about an experiential ethics. And in that way, the silicon chip has an experience.
Yes.
And it has principles. It's Li. It has the Li.
Yes.
It could not exist. It could not work the way it works without participating in the principles. I think we're trying to go beyond where things are ending up. So many people are upset about the way the teachings are being translated and used and misused, how they're getting watered down or they're turning into some capitalist tool. If you work not just with mind, if you actually work with your system, it's possible to go beyond the categories and step into something that is so experiential, it's so direct, it's so real, it takes your breath away, and you can't make anything else out of it other than what it is. What I think Radiant Heart Qigong does so well.
Thank you.
So there's two principles that I would like you to talk about. Without these principles, there is no way anyone would be able to practice appropriately. The 70% rule, the principle of underdoing, which Westerners may find very weird because it may sound like slacking off. Can you describe the power of underdoing?
When I teach it in the Qigong, it's like very transparent. I'm going to break it down a little bit, but I'll tell the story of working in corporate culture a little bit. And when I introduced underdoing as a principle, underdoing is not something that we're interested in. What else you got? So I said, underdoing is not underachieving. If you want to create longevity in your practice or in anything that you do, you need to understand how burning out all the time is not the way to longevity and to productivity. Once I demonstrate that to them in an embodied form, they start to understand it. And then they learn the value of conserving a certain amount of their outgoingness of presence and self-observation, internal recognition, you could say. Underdoing on the physical level is not moving into the full range of motion that you're capable of. No, sometimes we need to do that. It's part of reaching for something and you need to really stretch. In the practice of our Qigong, we work with underdoing so that the reserve of awareness is present into and integrated into the actual physical movement. So we bring this quality of embodied mindfulness into the motion. And it doesn't happen if the physical structures are pressed as far as they can. So when you learn to underdo in the practice, you're cultivating a kind of internal awareness that's intimately connected with the form that you're working with. It becomes extremely valuable in the calming and toning of the nervous system, working with not only the subtle bodies, but with all the systems of the body, the lymphatic system, circulatory system, coherency of the brain and nervous system, of course. So underdoing becomes the tenor of what is being practiced. In Qigong class, I'll say the form is the gateway to the practice of the principle. And in this sense, we're practicing coherency. And to practice coherency, you have to disengage from habitual patterns of interaction and awareness of yourself, and to re-engage with healing modality, working with a 70% of range of motion and leaving that 30% as the presence of mindful integration and awareness.
So I'm hearing you say something I think I either have missed or maybe I have never heard. And it's so profound. You're kind of blowing my mind. Over-efforting and overdoing is a function of disembodiment. And then if one is embodied with a particular kind of awareness, underdoing is what arises spontaneously, because this is what the Buddha meant when he said right effort.
Yeah. Are we proliferating longevity in the things that we do?
Yeah.
So many people have engaged in martial arts and they burn out early on and have injuries from overdoing their practice or practicing unskillfully. So one could easily say, yeah, this is not skillful effort to be 50 or 60 years old and flying through the air and trying to do high falls. There are other ways of practicing that allow for longevity in health.
Unless you have a mind that is telling you an ego identified story that says you can't be who you are without that.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what we're talking about. Authenticity is connected with humility. It's not a self-effacing humility. I don't do the same things I do in Aikido now than I did when I was a kid.
So I think we've just given another answer to how Qigong aids the arising of mental health. Embodied awareness of how the system is and know what the system can and cannot do. Appropriateness that arises in the action.
Yes.
My experience of Qigong is anyone can do it. There's no barrier. Is that your experience of Qigong?
That is my experience of Qigong. It doesn't have the physical barriers that other forms of practice, well, even yoga, let's say, but aerobic practices or practices that you might do in the gym, it's a malleable practice, but just about any health condition can practice some form of Qigong for benefit. People can do it when they have Alzheimer's or when they have Parkinson's disease, when they're recovering from injuries. Of course, it's important to know the skill, when to do it and when not to do it. Some of the spinal Qigong practices might not be appropriate for every person to do the full range of practice. The basic practices of pulsing, the basic form of working with the breath, it is absolutely integral to the effectiveness and the optimal benefits that come from a skillful Qigong practice.
If you are not ambulatory, you could still do Qigong. If you have problems with your shoulders, you can still do Qigong. If you have serious mental health issues on board, schizophrenia, psychosis, you can do Qigong when the right Qigong practice is delivered. Would you agree?
There are some contraindications to some forms of Qigong and some conditions where there could be contraindications. The self-empowering practices, the general and systemic practices of radiant body breathing, the core practices that we do in radiant heart Qigong can be modified in such a way that they are accessible. I wouldn't give someone a skill that didn't have some kind of natural self-regulatory presence in their own mental emotional states.
Yes.
Saying this out of experience, in long retreats, in the 30-day retreats that I taught at Spirit Rock and the long Zen Shishins and so on, lots of different things happen. And it's important, if you're doing these complementary practices, to know the range of your own physical, mental, emotional capacity. There are all these conditions that you named, especially the mental health conditions, which can be positively impacted by good Qigong with a guide.
That's also our way of saying it's important to go get trained before you deliver any Qigong to anyone.
Well said.
So you do have a very interesting interval breath training. You might want to describe the method because most people have never done breath meditation or breath training in this way.
Breath training is not at all unique in yogic and Qigong traditions. There are all kinds of forms of pranayama and breath training. Probably the mid to late 90s, I developed this interval breath training practice, have made that available to people over time. It's an interesting and unique approach to balancing and regulating the breath. So it uses symmetrical intervals of in-breath and out-breath with certain specific guidelines around that. So it'll start with a 4 or 5 second in-breath, 4 or 5 second out-breath, and you just kind of work with this with the sound of a bell to cue the in-breath and out-breath. It's not a rigid practice. It's a way of kind of working with deepening vital lung capacity to using this calming, symmetrical form of the breath. This is a cultivation of state and neural coherency that begins to take place when you practice these intervals, starting with 4 or 5 seconds in and 4 or 5 seconds out. You might do 3 of these. You might work 5, 6, and 7 seconds, and that will take place over 12 and a half minutes. And then you just return to normal breathing. You may notice a sense of settledness in your mental state. So people can work with this as a way of entering into shamatha and vipassana meditation or Zen, gradually increasing the intervals over weeks. I know that it has a very positive impact when I work with this in communities. It's a free download right now on my website under resources. People have really powerful, calming, centering experiences working with this external form of natural regulation.
Yeah, I think it's a great method for training the mind to not get lost. And then as the intervals lengthen, it's wonderful for people to get comfortable in that gap between the in-breath and out-breath, which can freak people out.
That's why we don't rush through trying to go as long as you can.
Is there anything we haven't talked about that you really want to talk about?
The importance of this time in human history calls us to practice. People can often think going on retreats or doing these self-cultivating practices might be selfish. It is anything but selfish. To cultivate mindful presence, to cultivate a sense of centering, listening, being present, empathy, compassion, awareness, all of these are transformative. I've listened to the Dalai Lama and other incredible teachers who say that compassion is absolutely essential if we are to survive as a species. Not just as a species, like the whole earth, so intimately interconnected. Having the opportunity to connect with something that heals and restores you is vital to our well-being, not just individually, but as an interconnected form of life in this field of life here on planet Earth.
Hear, hear. Thank you for bringing that up. So if people want to take advantage of your teaching and Radiate Heart Qigong, how can they do that?
So I do have a website, qigongdharma.com. And on that website are resources and calendars that tell about the various trainings and retreats, weekly classes, monthly classes, give us an opportunity to come together, to practice together, to listen to one another.
Qigong Dharma is spelled QIGONGDHARMA.com. This has been tremendously enlightening. Teja, thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom with all of us.
Thank you, Lisa. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to today's show. To get in touch, please visit groundlessground.com. Let's dedicate our efforts to the healing of our planet and all its inhabitants. See you next time on the Groundless Ground.